This brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Yeah. How do you feel that first day in February after all that ice and sleet, and we had that first 70-degree sun-shining day? Mother Nature must be smiling upon us, right? Or it's Christmas Eve, rushing around Penn Square Mall looking for a parking space. If you're me, that is not a hypothetical. You find one right at the very front of the mall. The stars must be aligned. It amazes me that how many of us turn into Hindus when things are coming up roses. You know, I must be living right because karma. On the other hand, what about those people who walk in upbeat to a performance of you and suddenly find out unexpectedly that they're being let go due to budget cuts? Or even more recently, fires sweeping through a town bolstered by 50-mile-an-hour winds, losing your home and everything that you own. What do we say in those moments? Many of us, God must be punishing me. And as much as we should know better, many of us still see bad news as a sign of some kind of divine retribution, that God is punishing us for something that we must have done wrong. So that's what happens to good things happening to people, bad things happening to good people. What about the third situation, right? How do we wrap our heads around when good things happen to bad people, right? How do we square that circle? And it plays into the parable that Jesus is telling this morning about the lost son. One of those stories that we were sharing yesterday that even people who are non-Christian are somewhat familiar with, right? It's one of those stories that has gotten into our culture. But I think that also that we, as Christians, because we hear it so often, we get a little overly familiar with it, right? And there are a few things that I want to point out that might go past our ears. I think it would make it even more impactful. And the first is this idea in the first place that the son would go to the father and ask for a share of the property, right? It's not the same as today, like one of your children coming up and saying, I want to go strike it out on my own. I need some seed money. Just give me a portion of it. It was way more than that. The property would never have been sold off. It would never be distributed until after the father had died. And even then, the oldest son would get the majority of the property, and the other sons might get something, right? So it's almost as if the son is going up to his father and saying, I don't care if you are alive or dead. It means nothing to me. I just want a portion of your estate. What is amazing is not so much even the father's response when the son returns back, but the father's response at the very outset of the parable. Instead of driving the son off, he gives him that share of the property. It is an astonishing act of generosity at the very outset. The second part that kind of might escape is just where the son goes. He not only turns his back on his father, he turns his back on his people as well. He's living in a far-off land. He's living with the Gentiles. Right? So he's not only left his family behind, he's also left behind who he is as well. Another thing is how he decides to come back, right? He sees how far that he's fallen. He thinks, I'll come back maybe as a hired hand. In the culture that Jesus is living in and the people are hearing this, a hired hand is actually in even worse position than the slaves. Right? When we hear slavery, we think of slavery in the context of our culture, kind of a chattel slavery. It wasn't quite the same then. I mean, sometimes people would be in such low estates that they would sell themselves to someone kind of as a bond servant, right? Although, easily translated, it is slave. But, these people, even though they had a lower status, they were oftentimes a part of the household. They were even, in some cases, treated like a part of the family. But hired hands were just day laborers. They had no security. They had no lasting relationship with the family. So this is how far he's fallen. He doesn't even want to sell himself back into slavery to his father. He wants to come back as a hired hand, just doing whatever he can to eke out a living for his survival. And then finally, it is how the Father reacts when he comes back. And I think for many of us, and especially for those of us who are parents, we've had numerous times where we can probably really relate to the Father's response. That is not how the people who are hearing this parable would hear it. No, they would have been shocked by the Father's response. I mean, it literally would have been outrageous. I mean, in this patriarchal society, that the Father would have ever given in to that request in the first place would have been a huge dishonor. It would have been shameful. It would have been seen as weak. It would have been a disgrace to his family for him to respond like this. Everyone in that community would have known about it. And to see the Father's responding the way he did would just have been mind-blowing. And not only that, but I mean, imagine this being the kind of clothes that the Father would wear, robes. I mean, to have to lift up his robes and run out to meet his son. I mean, talk about a shocking sign of humility and love, something that would have just been completely out of character for someone who had been a respectable man, this owner of property and great wealth. So a few things that I just kind of wanted to point out that maybe change the context of the story a little bit. But then we get to the crux of the story, which is the Father immediately restoring the status of his son. Completely forgiven, no punishment, no probation, no list of things that you've got to do this and this and this to get back into our good graces. No, I mean, a celebration, the fattened calf. I mean, the fattened calf only brought out at the most special of occasions. It would be completely bewildering to the people who were listening to the story as Jesus told it. People who valued honor and justice oftentimes above that of mercy. We hear this story called the prodigal son, and it's really the father in the story who is the prodigal. It is the father who is lavishing extravagant grace, mercy, love, and reconciliation with the son. And Jesus, is using this parable to show everyone God's unconditional love and forgiveness. Something that is radically different from the kind of transactional righteousness that the religious leaders of the day taught. And again, just like every other Jesus story, he's flipping the story upside down with the religious expectations of what the culture expected. In all honesty, it probably left the people hearing it probably a little unsettled, challenging what their understanding of being in relationship of God was all about. And it's this point of the story when we get the third main character coming in. I mean, and if this is a movie, you could almost imagine like the dramatic dum, 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 the older brother coming in. He comes home to a party that is in full swing. And he's got the response that honestly, I think many of us would have. Like, he is so angry that he won't even go inside the house. The father has to come outside the house to him. So angry that he can't even say his brother's name. I mean, you can almost hear the way he spits it out. When this son of yours. Friends, I can tell you this. If I come home and Linda says, "Do you know what that daughter of yours did?" I've got two things I know. I've got a 33% chance of getting it right. And I got a 100% chance of knowing it is not anything that made mama happy. Right? So it's a story that for us may be easy to pick sides. Right? And as you listen to it, I'm curious where you found yourself. Which one of these characters did you most identify with? And how many of you identified with the younger son? Now, I know that I have felt like that younger son at times in my life. I mean, not to the extent of like losing everything and living in pigsties, but there were certainly times growing up where I felt the world revolved around me and everything that I wanted. Or how many of you identify with the father in the story? And I tell you, as I've gotten older, I've kind of gone through that phase where I probably relate to him far more than I used to. times where I think I would be, well within my rights, not just with family and children, with any situation where I could just throw my hands up at something that I see as unjust behavior, right? But, and I say with God's help, able to see past that and be able to exhibit grace and forgiveness, and in some cases, reconciliation. I'm still not going to be dividing up our property before I die, so don't worry about that. But the real question is, how many of us identify with the older brother? And he's the one that I can identify with more than I care to admit, because I can feel his righteous indignation, anger over the way that his brother treated the father. After all, he had been the dutiful son. He does the right thing without ever expecting anything in return. So where do you land on these three main characters? And it frustrates me that Jesus leaves the parable open, right? I mean, it's like many of the parables. He shares the story to make us think. He never answers directly for us. So if you're like me, that you like things with a nice bow on top, tied up and packaged, you don't get that, right? So what are we supposed to come away with? Is it as simple as just kind of identifying with one of those three characters? Just like every parable that Jesus tells, if you go a little bit more under the surface, there's always an added twist that we're not seeing. And the twist in this one is the fourth character, right? The one you probably forgot about. I can see a couple of you like scratching your heads like, well, who was it? I'm looking at the bulletin. Maybe I should say characters, because who is Jesus talking to at the very beginning of the parable? The Pharisees and the Pharisees and the scribes. Do you remember why they were grumbling? All right. Jesus hangs out with sinners. The same old song and dance that you see from the Pharisees following him around in every parable. It always gets me that the Pharisees and the scribes are following him around, complaining that he hangs out with sinners, and they're always following him around, right? It's like the outhouse calling the barn stinky. But that is what we are stuck with this week, right? It's the story we're being told. Now, by itself, this story has got some incredible lessons. The Father's unconditional love, the forgiveness for the Son. But if you think about the Pharisees who are grumbling about who Jesus is hanging out with sinners, and then consider who are the characters of the story, it begins to paint a totally different picture. Who's the youngest son? Well, that would be the sinners that Jesus is surrounding himself with. And so who does that make the older brother? The Pharisees and the scribes, right? So Tim Keller, who was a Presbyterian pastor, a theologian, he wrote this wonderful book called The Prodigal God. And last year after I read it, it completely changed my perspective of this story. And the theme that Keller gets to is that it's not only the younger son who is the one that is alienated from the father, right? The older brother is just as alienated from the father as the younger son. The younger rebellious, the older son self-righteous. The younger alienated by his rebellious nature and sin, but the older brother is alienated by his prideful obedience and his judgmental nature. And so the conclusion that Keller comes to is that true reconciliation and salvation obviously can never come from our own efforts at righteousness. It is only through the Father's extravagant, undeserved grace. That ultimately it is both brothers in this story who are invited to embrace God's unconditional love and forgiveness. The younger because of his immorality, and the older because of this moralistic superiority. Right? So the takeaway from this is how we respond to that unmerited grace, especially when we, who maybe sometimes relate to the older brother, see it being bestowed on people that we feel are less deserving of it. At its heart, we find a message of reconciliation. Right? It's a story that asks us, is it better to be right, or is it better to be in relationship with one another? And with polarization, in almost every facet of life that we find ourselves in, we find it in the church, we find it in families, we certainly see it out in the world. And we find that polarization causing broken relationships at their extreme end. And so what would Jesus tell us to do? And ultimately, I don't think that he necessarily would tell us what to do, because he never outright tells people what to do. But he tells us these parables and he makes us think. He lays out guardrails for us. I mean, you have like a guardrail on one side of the road of forgiveness. You have mercy on the other side acting as a guardrail. And then you got the dotted line down the middle of love and charity. And really, it's up to us kind of in our free will to stay bouncing between those guardrails and then hopefully just not going careening over the side. I don't know that Jesus would give us a direct answer, but he does give us the question that we ask ourselves today. Is it better to be right, or is it better to be in relationship?